So I'm going to be talking today about how the United Nations maps the world. In particular, we're going to be looking at two UN world political maps. These maps are not used very often. I rarely see them on the internet, but I think they're nonetheless quite important because they give the official view of geopolitical organization of the global community of nations, if you will. Now, maps used by the United States and other countries are going to be slightly different. For example, the United States will map Kosovo as an independent country, where the UN maps it as a wayward part of Serbia, just as Russia is going to show Crimea as part of Russia, and the UN is going to map it as part of Ukraine. But these are just marginal issues. The basic structure of the world political map that the United Nations provides is pretty much the same as that found officially with virtually all countries of the world. You can find these maps by going to the UN Cartographic Archive. The two that I will look at today, one is called The World, and the other is The World Today. You can find The World on a pull-down menu, and then The World Today is under More Maps, thematic maps in particular. This schema makes it seem as if the first map is more important, but it's actually the second one, The World Today, that is the more sophisticated of the two. But anyway, we'll start with the first one, The World. This is the map. It's very simple, very straightforward. You can see simply a two-color scheme, land and water, with land areas divided into sovereign states and their dependencies. It's important to note how it differentiates sovereign states or UN members, independent countries, from their dependencies. It's very straightforward. Sovereign states are shown in all capital letters, whereas dependencies are not. And then the dependencies have in parentheses the controlling country. So you could see here a number of sovereign states in Southeast Asia in all caps. And then if we go to the close-up on the right, in French Polynesia, we can see a very different way of mapping them. And I would note that contrary to the labeling here, all of these islands are actually French Polynesia. There is a big problem we find here, at least I think it's a problem, in that this style of differentiating dependencies from independent states also seemingly differentiates exclaves or territories that are removed from the main part of a given country. They're mapped in exactly the same way. So you could see Alaska, a constituent state of the United States, is mapped the same way that Greenland is, whereas Greenland is essentially an autonomous country that is under the sovereign umbrella of the Kingdom of Denmark. So it's a very different, it's a confusing way of looking at this. And it's also contrary to the textual note on the map, which says that the parentheses shows the administrating power. And the United States is not the administrating power of Alaska, rather Alaska is part of the United States. So it's a very important differentiation here that is not shown. And there are exceptions here as well. So Russia has an exclave, a removed part of the Russian geopolitical body, and it is labeled here simply as Russian Federation. So they don't have that in parentheses. So it's not consistent the way it's done. More important, though, is to talk about what this map conveys. And to me, anyway, what it conveys is a vision of a global community of nations where all lands, or virtually all lands, are a part of a UN member state, either an integral part of it or a dependency of it. There's no overlap, nice clean boundaries, and everything is mapped this way. Well, not quite everything, as there are a few exceptions. One oddity, though, is the map itself gives a textual note telling us that it's actually not officially endorsed. So there's a little wiggle room that the UN cartographers sort of give themselves here. And it is very important to note that the cartographic vision that I've been talking about has a number of exceptions on this map. And I'll go through these pretty quickly. There are two, what I call unmarked deviations, and then 9 marked deviations, where we don't have nice clean boundaries and we don't have clear and straightforward portrayals of sovereignty. So one of them, well, actually the most glaring of these exceptions would be Western Sahara. And if you look closely at this territory just south of Morocco, it's not mapped as a country. It's not in all capital letters. That makes it seem as if it's mapped as a a dependency or a distant part of a country, but there's no sovereign power listed in parentheses. So it's essentially mapped as a dependency of nothing. And no other place is mapped like that. So it's left intentionally ambiguous, or so it seems to me. And then Antarctica is an exception too. It's mapped in all capital letters as if it were a country, but it's italicized. So again, it's just something that doesn't quite fit in this schema. And I think this kind of labeling shows that. There are 9 territorial disputes that are depicted on the map, both cartographically with boundaries and in textual notes that you could see I've put in that red triangle. And I've indicated with ovals here the locations of these different disputes that are shown. So these are shown in different ways. Some are shown textually with this notes, and most of them are shown graphically with dashed borders or dotted borders or dashed and solid borders, not in any sort of consistent way. And we'll see the inconsistency as we go through them. So the 3 disputes that are highlighted by notes are the boundary dispute between South Sudan and Sudan, South Sudan being the newest member of the United Nations, joining in 2011. India and Pakistan, which have they have a number of territorial disputes, only one of which is shown, that in the Kashmir area. And then the dispute between the United Kingdom and Argentina over the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas as they're known in Argentina. The first 2 are shown graphically as well. The last one isn't, because they're not showing boundaries in sea space, and the Falkland Islands are obviously islands in the sea, and so no boundary is shown. So instead, we simply have a label with a textual note associated with it. And I would note as well, though, that this textual note does not indicate that South Georgia, UK dependency, located to the east of Falkland Islands, is also claimed by Argentina. They're actually part of the same dispute. South Sudan and Sudan, a dash border is used to show that the border, has not yet been determined. Actually, the issue is the border is contested. Sudan controls certain areas claimed by South Sudan. Let's look next at this, probably the most complex of all of these disputes, that between India and Pakistan over an area that was until recently known as Jammu and Kashmir. Still is sometimes, although India has changed its terminology here. But this is one place where we see combination of dashed lines and a dotted line to try to convey the complexity here. Let me highlight this so that we can see more clearly what's going on. First, we have a dotted line, which indicates actual control. India controlling areas to the south and to the east of that line, Pakistan to the north and the west. Note that it doesn't actually connect with the solid boundary to the north, and that's because this is the area of the Siachen Glacier, which is hotly contested and isn't as firmly sort of agreed upon. The agreement here is that, well, India and Pakistan have made no permanent agreement, but they made a temporary agreement that this is the line of control for the time being. And then we have dashed lines showing actual claims. So Pakistan claims all the territory down to that southern dashed line, and India claims all the territory to the north-south running dashed line further to the west. Now, what's interesting is we see the same sort of mapping in another part of the world, but it conveys the exact opposite situation. So if we look at the boundary here between Israel and the West Bank, Palestinian territories, we also have a dotted line. I will highlight it here. You have to really focus in to see that it's actually dotted. But unlike the portrayal in the India-Pakistan case, this is showing not actual control, but rather claims or sort of agreed upon boundary according to the global community. But the situation on the ground is quite different, because Israel has actual control, total control over many lands to the east of that dotted line, and partial controls over all of them. So you're using the same sort of cartographic strategy, but it's showing a different situation. Also with dashed lines, we find sort of similar problems. For example, the boundary between Ethiopia and Somalia is contested. The issue here, though, is where the boundary is to be placed. Somalia would claim more territory than it actually controls. We see the same sort of dashed line between North Korea and South Korea, but this is a completely different issue. This is a boundary existence issue, if you will, because neither state views that boundary as officially existing. Both claim that Korea should be one country and shouldn't have a boundary at all. Both look forward to unification, however unlikely that may be. Other places on the map, we see disputed territory with a combination of a solid line and a dashed line. For example, between South Sudan and Kenya and between Egypt and Sudan. These territorial disputes arose during the colonial period when the United Kingdom essentially controlled all of these territories in question. British administrators drew a straight, surveyed east-west line to separate colonial territories here, but then they created a separate administrative line because it was more convenient to administer areas that were then part of Sudan from Kenya. This actually had to do with Turkana migratory pastoral peoples. It was a complicated issue. And the same between Egypt and Sudan. They drew an official line, but then part of the area on the Egyptian side was actually administered by Sudan. After independence, these have continued to be disputed territories, and the United Nations is marking that. I would note, though, that again, we have the opposite situation in that in the Elimi Triangle on the map to the left, that's actually controlled by Kenya and claimed by Sudan, whereas with the Halayib Triangle on the map to the right, that's actually controlled by Egypt and claimed by Sudan. And as one final very interesting note, in this case, Sudan believes that the administrative boundary should be followed, and Egypt believes that the straight official surveyed boundary should be followed, which means there's a little area called Bir Tawa, which neither country claims and neither country controls. This is a no person's land, essentially. That is an oddity on the map. Let's go back to the Jammu and Kashmir issue, and we can see something else on this map, which is the area that is claimed by India but controlled by China. This was taken over from India by China in 1962. China calls it Aksai Chin, but the interesting thing here is it has a solid line all the way around it, as if it really were an independent country. That independent countries are mapped by having a solid white line around them, as is Aksai Chin. But again, this is a disputed territory that's kind of hidden here. And then on the other side of India, we find something very similar, but again, it's the opposite situation. This is most of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. India controls it, China claims it, and the UN maps it in this ambiguous way by circling it with a white line as if it were an independent state, but not labeling it. So those are the major territorial disputes and how they're mapped. I do want to mention some labeling oddities or things that I just can't quite figure out. The first is the island mapping. In some parts of the world, we have absolutely insignificant islands labeled. Here's Tromelin Island off Madagascar, some 200 acres, often inundated, but yet it has a label. It's not actually shown. But then on the map on the right, we can see Taiwan, islands of Japan, Okinawa, very important islands that have no labels at all. So it's kind of curious as to why that would be. Another curiosity is how islands are mapped, in that some are actually mapped as territories with this brown color and a white line around it, but many are mapped simply as borders, just as simple white lines. And you might think that the larger islands would be mapped as territories and the smaller ones simply as white lines, but you can see this is not necessarily true. There's some pretty large islands that are just given as lines and smaller ones that are actually mapped as territories. Another cartographic oddity to me is why so little effort has been made to represent actual shapes. And I just show this with the UN map of Japan, a conventional map of Japan focusing on the island of Shikoku. And you can just see the UN has a very schematic view of this. It doesn't even really capture its shape much at all. Same with size. You can see how Northern Ireland is mapped by the UN as a fraction of its actual size, looking at a conventional map. So they're not really taking much care to conserve size and shape in areas. And last, I just have to ask, what's the point of the giant Antarctica? Why do we have to go all the way down to 90 degrees south? I just copied Antarctica, copied Africa on this map, and I split up Antarctica and overlaid it so we can see that Africa vastly larger than Antarctica, but Antarctica portrayed here as larger. This has to do with the map projection that is used, but it just seems to me kind of pointless to include all of Antarctica on a map like this because it conveys no useful information. I think a more serious problem, though, is what I would call vague, simplistic, and anodyne depictions of really complex and heated disputes and controversies. I find it almost amusing that the UN will say the final status of Jammu and Kashmir has not yet been agreed upon by the parties, as if agreement is nigh, it's going to be coming soon, and they just haven't quite figured it out. Well, that obviously doesn't really convey the situation, but it does give a diplomat's view of it, I suppose we could say. Let me move on to the second map, which is a bit more complex. That's the world today. And you can see here we have, we don't have just a two-color scheme. We have several other colors, although when you just look at the territories here, we really only see three: yellow for water, blue for most lands, and then we see a little bit of red there, and that is the Western Sahara again. That's the only really red territory we can see. I want to expand the key here so that we could see it a little bit more clearly. So blue is showing member states of the United Nations officially, but I have to add, and their self-governing dependencies. Greenland is not a member state of the United Nations, but it is a self-governing dependency of Denmark, which is a member of the United Nations. So I just think their label here doesn't really convey all the information that it should. Then we have another category, observer non-member states in yellow. Well, you can't see any in that yellow color. There are a couple, and I'll focus in on them in a second. In green, we have non-member states, meaning independent countries, sovereign states, if you will, that are simply not members of the United Nations. There are two here. They're very hard to see, and I'll focus in on them in a second. Then finally, in red, we have what are called by the United Nations non-self-governing territories. And this includes a number of dependencies, not all of them. Some are considered self-governing, again, like Greenland, but others like, for example, Guam are considered non-self-governing. They're put in red here. And Western Sahara as well, which is not portrayed as a dependency on this map, just like it was not portrayed on the previous map. If we want to look at this green category, non-member states of the United Nations, so in other words, mapped as sovereign states, but not UN members, we just have two. They're actually quite close together, but the way the map splits the world, they seem far apart. That's Niue, small island, only about 1,400 people, I believe. And then the Cook Islands, these are both in Polynesia, and they're both connected to New Zealand. But it's an interesting question. Are they dependencies of New Zealand, or are they independent countries? Here they're mapped as independent countries. On the other CIA map, the world, they're mapped as either dependencies or integral parts of New Zealand. The CIA also maps them as dependencies of New Zealand. There's a very interesting phenomenon here, which is the phenomenon of what we could call free association. And there are only two countries that have other states in free association, United States and New Zealand. And the United States has three countries in free association: Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, shown here in light green. And New Zealand has two, Niue and Cook Islands. In both these cases, the countries in free association have given over the responsibility for defense to the larger country. In return, they get a number of benefits, free ability to migrate to the metropolitan country, for example. In the case of Marshall Islands, the United States has major military concessions. So it becomes questionable, are these really truly independent countries, or are they almost independent countries? But anyway, the three states in free association with the United States are all UN members, whereas those in free association with New Zealand are not. Presumably, they could become members of the United Nations if they wanted to, but they have not expressed the desire to do so. But the United Nations has recognized they have the ability to sign treaties, for example, which is really a crucial feature of whether or not you have independence. Let me move on to another category here in yellow, observer non-member states of the United Nations. This might be seen as kind of a halfway step into the United Nations. You can attend their meetings, you observe, you don't get a vote in the General Assembly. We don't see any on the map here, but there are two. One would be the Holy See or Vatican City. So you can see it is labeled in yellow and its little square is in yellow. So I suppose it is mapped that way. This is really just a collection of a few buildings in Rome. And then we have the state of Palestine. Its label is offset. It's in the middle of the ocean because its territory is so small. But we could see here, A is for the state of Palestine, which is not a UN member, but is an observer of the United Nations. But notice here, it is mapped in green, which is an oddity. Let me focus in a little bit more. Now, if you remember, green was used for non-member states of the United Nations, Niue and Cook Islands, but yet the Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza, are mapped in exactly the same way. I believe this is merely an error. They should have been mapped in yellow and they were mapped in green instead. I have simplified and clarified this map to show you how the UN maps it and contrast that with a conventional map. And one point I want to get across here is the diminution of the West Bank. You can see the West Bank has been reduced to a territory about the size of Gaza. In actuality, it is vastly larger. Or just compare the size of Israel with the size of the West Bank in the UN mapping scheme. Let's focus a little bit more on the non-self-governing territories. Mostly what we see here is Western Sahara, but if you look closely, you can see a lot of red labels and then maybe a few other red territories if your eyes are good enough. The United Nations has another map that explicitly simply shows these non-self-governing territories and their administrating powers. We have the same issue we had here on the first UN map, though. All of these non-self-governing territories with the yellow labels that are associated with a administrating power, which is depicted in white, with the exception of the Western Sahara. So it's shown as a dependency without any state administering it. So another oddity. So here essentially is the UN depiction of Western Sahara. And then if we were actually to show the situation on the ground, it would look like this, because Morocco invaded and annexed almost all, well, it invaded all of Western Sahara and annexed most of it. There's a little sliver of territory here run by a would-be state, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. There's about 35,000 people living here. There are a number of countries that do recognize this as an independent country, but it is not a member of the United Nations, obviously, and hence is ignored by that body. These non-self-governing territories look very small on a world map, but if we take this unusual map, which shows countries' land areas and their sea spaces. So by the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, every country gets a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of water around its land territories. So you can see that the United Kingdom has a number of these non-self-governing territories, tiny areas, but pretty large sections of sea space. So I just throw this in to show sort of the importance of these areas. Back to this second UN map, it has a lot of the same problems that the first one did. So we've seen this before, mapping exclaves in the same way as dependencies, with the exception of Russia's Kaliningrad. Same style of mapping disputed territories. So again, we can see Aksai Chin, Arunachal Pradesh, mapped as if they were a country essentially, but without any label. If we compare these two maps, my takeaway message would be that the second map, the world today, has more precise categories, in a way, as a more sophisticated map, but it has more severe distortions of size, shape, and location. So to just quickly go through a few of these. Here's a conventional depiction of the Greater Antilles Islands in the Caribbean. Here's how they are mapped on the world today. I preserved the same scale, just simply copying them out. And then I wanted to put Hispaniola as it would be conventionally mapped on the way that it would be mapped by the United Nations. So they're not conserving size by any means, or shape. What I mean here by the death of the logo map, how to give a logo map is, it's a map simply showing the shape of a country, or it could be a state like Texas. Texas has a lot of logo maps, where the shape is a stand-in for the country. It's essentially its logo, instantly recognizable, used in products, used for all sorts of things. But when the the shape of a map is unrecognizable, then, but obviously isn't going to serve that. And so I just ask if anyone could guess these countries from their shape. I wouldn't have been able to, but anyway, that's the Netherlands, we have Nepal, we have Bangladesh, and we have Costa Rica. Location is off as well in many cases, and I won't go into great detail on here, but I'll just show you a UN depiction of the so-called ABC Islands, which are affiliated with the Netherlands. They're not, they have complicated relations with the Netherlands, just put it that way. On the bottom, I have an actual satellite image showing the position, and then I'll just show where the United Nations in their second map would actually place them, pretty far off from where they're actually located. A more important issue, though, is does this map actually reflect the situation of the United Nations? What we see here is 193 sovereign states, all members of the UN, all portrayed in the same manner, as if they're sort of equal members of this global community of nations. And in actuality, as we all know, it doesn't work that way at all. There are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are vastly more influential than any other. So I think this would be a much more accurate depiction of how this organization actually works, but it's hidden. A few points on aesthetic considerations of the UN global mapping, particularly the world today. I myself find it rather crude and ugly. I think some people might find it a minimalist masterpiece, though, because they convey the world with very few lines, make it very sort of stripped down and simple. And it obviously is going to vary with beholders' views. But I would note that it's not exactly minimalist. You don't need to have that kind of complex depiction of the Northwest Siberia if minimalism is your goal. It doesn't do anything. It conveys nothing. To be quite honest, I find this map disturbing. I find it creepy. I'm kind of fascinated by it because I just think it's so ugly. But anyway, that's simply my view of this map. Aesthetics is not the issue. More important issues is the UN mapping program logically consistent? I think I've shown that it isn't. Not a lot of attention is put to it. It's almost, in many cases, seems like an afterthought. And another important question is, does the UN mapping program portray global political divisions accurately? And it doesn't. It's not trying to. It's trying to show the UN view of the world, not the way the world is actually structured. For example, let's just take this UN depiction of countries around the Black Sea. We see, again, stable, uncontested nation-state territories, countries snapping together firmly at their boundaries like a jigsaw puzzle, no disputed territories, no issues. If we were actually to map in actual situations here, we'd find there are a number of breakaway states. A few of them are recognized as independent countries by a few others. For example, uh, Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Nauru recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent countries. The United Nations does not, the United States doesn't, most countries don't, but they are not parts of Georgia as they are mapped by the UN. This is no surprise. Most countries are going to map the world as they think it ought to be rather than as is. So if we were to give this map an honest title, it would be something more on the line of the UN's view of how the world should be organized, maybe. And this map would be maybe given an honest title of the UN's view of how the world should be organized, with a few acknowledged exceptions thrown in the back. So to conclude this lecture on the UN's mapping of the world, I think it's best to go back to the initial slide that we saw showing the homepage of the UN's Geospatial Information section, or basically mapping division. So we looked at two maps from this site, one, The World Today, and the other called The World. But it's important to put these maps in their context to see how they are framed by the UN. And that way we can get a better sense of the kind of narrative that these maps are really encapsulating. So what I've done with the pull down menu where it says select a region or area of interest, I've just shown what you get when you go into that pull down menu. And you get the world map, which we've shown. That's I've put that in bold font, but that comes after we see a set of historical maps showing the world in 1944, and then the member states of the UN by decade. And the same with the world today, where that fits in on this cartographic archive is under this section called thematic maps or more maps, and it's paired with a map of the world in 1945. So what these maps are part of a larger series of maps showing the development of the United Nations and its spread across the world. And I think that's really what these maps are trying to get across. So let's start at this depiction of the world in 1944. We see a very simple map. It has borders, but no labels whatsoever. It has the same sort of mapping style as the world today, with either straight north, south, east, west lines or lines at a 45-degree angle to that. No other angles of lines allowed. It looks surprisingly like a modern map of the world, especially if you look at, say, the Americas. If you look more closely, you'll see that British India is undivided yet. You know, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are the same. French West Africa is there as one unit. But it looks sort of surprisingly modern, and it's all gray. So this was the world before the United Nations. Actually, it is not at all an accurate map. If I do a detail from how Europe is mapped, and then show you a map that actually shows Europe in 1944, and it actually shows it over that entire span of time, you can see that the map of Europe that the UN has for 1944 is really Europe after, well, certainly after 1945, after the end of World War II and the post-war settlement had been put in place. So the boundaries of Germany, for example, interesting and undivided Germany, but of Germany and Poland are boundaries that wouldn't come into place for another year or so. There's another real oddity of this map, is it's showing Ukraine and what today we call Belarus, then it was the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Moldova as if they were independent countries. It works in a way for Ukraine and Belarus because these were actually separate member states of the UN in the Cold War period. When the UN was being negotiated, the Soviet Union insisted that all of its Soviet Socialist republics should be member states. The United States said, well, in that case, every one of the states of the United States should be member states. And eventually a compromise was reached where Ukraine and Belarus had separate membership. Moldova never did, so this is perhaps just a simple error on the map. But anyway, as I said before, what's important here is the historical succession. So here's the world in 44, and then we have a map showing the next decade. And what we're going to see over the next few maps is the world turning from gray to blue as countries become member states of the UN, quite a few at the beginning, and they turn blue and they also get their name as a label on the map. So we could jump up for the next decade and see after 1960, most of the European colonies in sub-Saharan Africa become independent, so they become blue. Japan is a member now of the UN. We still have a number of places that aren't members, but as we go through, say, to the next decade, we can see they're diminishing decade by decade, fewer and fewer. Jump ahead again to 1976, 1985. There are just a couple of them. And then we switch to the next decade, the post-Cold War decade, and we get a lot of new states. The Soviet Union has been divided, Yugoslavia has been divided, and so on. But that doesn't jump out at you when you look at the map. What does is simply the increasing number of blue countries or blue states and the decreasing number of non-member states. Here, all we can really see, if we look closely, we can see Switzerland is still not a member. We have Greenland, dependency of Denmark. We have the Western Sahara that we've talked about. French Guiana is shown as a non-member state. But otherwise, virtually every sizable state is shown here as a member state. We jump again, and Switzerland finally becomes a member state. And that basically is the same map will be then replicated for the next decade because not much has changed. Greenland is still shown as a non-member state, and oddly, French Guiana is still shown as a non-member state. For example, if we look in closely here we have French Guiana, but it had been an integral part of France since 1946, an overseas department. Again, this to me just seems like an error. When we finally get to the world today, we do have French Guiana shown as a member state or as part of a member state, as we do with Greenland. So as I mentioned before, really, other than small islands, Western Sahara is the only sort of exceptional area. This map should be contrasted with the map that's next to it in the menu, which is the map of the world in 1945. So again, we look at these two maps, we see a kind of story that's given. The story is that of a very complicated geopolitical world in 1945, where we have a lot of member states and we have non-member states and we have dependencies and we have states with a special treaty relationship. These would be protectorates of the United Kingdom like Oman or Kuwait. We have states that were under the United Nations trustee system, which is a bit like the League of Mandates, a preparation for independence. So anyway, a very complicated map of the world. And then again, the world today, much simpler, just a few incongruities that are still on the map, and kind of implies that the world is becoming homogenous in the sense that all of these polities are becoming member states. What, of course, it doesn't show is that as the number of member states increases, some of these states are actually collapsing. Somalia, for example, in 1991, it hasn't been a cohesive state since then, but it retains its position on the map. Finally, I think another way to look at this is to look at other ways that the United Nations portrays the world. And its flag makes a cartographic statement in quite a strong manner. A very different view of the world, sort of an unusual polar projection. But here we have a world without boundaries at all, without states. Not so much a United Nations here, almost as a united world, because the nations are gone. It is simply one world in one vision. It's an unusual map projection. I would just point out it's quite unlike the Mercator projection, which greatly exaggerates the size of polar areas. This actually exaggerates the size of areas in the southern hemisphere. So I just copied North America and Australia and then overlaid them. Australia is about the size of the lower 48 US states, but here it's shown as almost the size of North America. And perhaps that is fitting. It might be a good way for the United Nations to portray the world, because the Mercator projection that exaggerates the high latitude areas is so ubiquitous and so problematic that we might think of this as a good corrective against that view. And perhaps we should see this as a better emblem of the UN, and it's certainly one that is much more widely used, much more widely seen than are those official UN maps of the world and the world today. Thank you. That is the end of the lecture.